Hey bro, kamusta?
Kumusta? Okay naman. Susulat, nagma-martial arts,
Ayan.
buhat, buhat-buhat lang pag may time.
I know, I
Gym,
know.
time naman tayo.
Namiss
Ikaw?
kita pare, namiss kita pare. Well, I'm glad that you're taking care of yourself, right? And
Oh, actually, I always hear from you and Ronald these days.
yeah, wag kang mainggit. Mahal ka namin.
Tara ako eh. Gusto ko sumali sa conversation eh. Marami
Yes,
rin para kay parang Ronald eh.
it's
Na
good.
naging regular mo na rin. Hindi naman sa iniisip ko nakakompetensya ko siya.
Hindi
Actually,
naman
gusto ko
masyado.
sumama.
No, no. So apparently, how it turning out, Lelo, is each of us have a niche kind of fan base. So yung Ronald Haydarian one has a fan base. Haydarian Lelo one has a fan base. So hopefully we'll combine that soon, no? And Ronald he keeps on saying na excited siya to hopefully three of us. Kasi I'm not sure, 11:30 p.m. is his time. But maghanap tayo ng oras hopefully next time, bro. No?
Or pag nandiyan ako
Yes,
mag-live
let's
live.
definitely do a Tres Marias. Yeah. Or Cuatro with Mark Gamboa para to mix it up.
That was
Yes,
really fun.
that was definitely fun. Bro, okay, let's do this. This is interesting. Pag-usapan natin, I mean of course you heard things I and Ronald have discussed together, separately, etc. But balikan natin itong issue na to because remember we discussed about how corruption does not seem to have the kind of mobilizing effect that it used to have, let's say, 10 years ago. I don't know if you were around, right, in the town when yung nangyari sa Luneta, all the PDAF, scandal, Pinoy being put under pressure, and then later on you had the DAP constitution ruling. So ironically, under quite a relatively clean government back then, there was a lot of anger and mobilization. 10 years later, medyo, I mean, the splitting that the COA is reporting, ombudsman office coming in and saying, COA, mo report yan, like, I don't know. And then, the refusal of many people to explain what's going on. And then you have multiple people in the cabinet, including a former associate justice, trying to explain away things. I mean, and yet, I mean, I have no illusions about this creating a massive political shock. Or maybe it's sowing the seeds of political decline for let's say Sara Duterte for that matter. Ikaw, what's your as a historian, Lele, what is your understanding of what's going on in the country with this confidential fund
Medyo
situation?
recent history lang bro Kasi naalala ko nung 2010 nung tumatakbo si Pinoy tapos yung tagline niya kung walang korap, walang mahirap. Tapos hard anti-corruption platform. May nakausap ako na high-level
Right.
campaign operator ng, well, at the time, hindi isang grupo na hindi naman ganun kasi pathetic kay Pinoy. So
Yeah.
I tuned the comment out a little bit at that time, but I realized in retrospect na tama yung operator na to. Ang sabi niya sa akin, yung campaign na yan, baka gumana yan ngayon, pero ang backfire niyan, sobrang tindi. Kasi
Right.
kung nangako ka na walang corrupt, kahit konting corruption lang, yari ka na because you will be perceived as a hypocrite. Di
Right.
ba? So ngayon is a kind of opposite because wala namang big promise of anti-corruption either from Duterte or Marcos. Unity naman yung promise, di ba? Na kaya nilang patawarin yung mga ganyan. That's one thing. The second historical point I want to make is, yung nga, we mentioned in a previous podcast na 2010, the number one concern of voters was corruption. Kailangan malinis yung tumatakbo. 2016, dalawa na yung concern, tayo na.
Right.
Tied yung may magagawa at yung hindi corrupt. And then by the time you get to 2022, number one concern na yung may magagawa at hindi na ganun ka-concern yung corruption. So meron ka talagang narrative na nakikita na less important na yung corruption para sa taong bayan. And I think that really stems from a kind of cynicism. And this we know naman from the ethnographic
Yeah.
data. So colleagues of ours, like for example, si Nicole Curato is asking Marcos supporters, bakit niyo siya
Yeah.
binoboto? Alam niyo ba na corrupt siya? And usually ang sagot is, well, that's possible and we think it's likely he's corrupt, pero lahat naman sila corrupt eh. So, doon na
Right.
lang tayo sa ginagawa. So yun yung data points na nakikita natin dito. And then of course, I think there are some other factors here na mas mahirap ipaliwanag through data points kasi hindi naman siguro aaminin ng mga supporters on the ground eh.
Right.
This they've already committed to the Dutertes, they've already committed to the Marcoses at hindi na matitinag yung kanilang loyalty regardless of kung ano mangyari. Ito yung I might call this the hindi pa uhuling buhay phenomenon. Ikaw, what are the historical points you wanna point out dito sa corruption issue na to?
Yeah, I mean, again, alam naman na approach ko comparative, di ba? So interesting, I remember a few years ago when we had the talk in Harvard Law School, I gave the Philippine perspective, but also comparative. So we had experts from Brazil, experts from Turkey, etc. But the Brazil one was very interesting because remember, sumabog itong
Corruption ni Lula.
exactly. Paano yung Lula, who was supposed to be the most progressive president they had, right? And then in the case of the Philippines also, you see how the issue of national sensitivity, the DAP, and all of that also was very high when you had a reformist president. So what you have is sometimes this ironic, paradoxical, if not dialectical dynamic kung saan just when you have a semi-clean government who's trying to fix the problem, that's where things go down, which kind of reminds me of what you can call the Tocqueville trap. Remember, Tocqueville said that revolutions often happen when regimes try to reform themselves, right? But a bit too late, right? When cynicism is already there, or it's so chronic and it's so deep, hindi mo siya talaga matatanggalan. And I think this is where yun yung problema natin, di ba? Both in the case of Brazil and the Philippines, we had progressive administrations who really bore the brunt of the backlash against corruption and down the road, also after they were out of power. But also, we saw that the institutions were very weak. Like in the case of Brazil, it came out those so-called Harvard boys, di ba? Yung mga tatlo mukhang supermodel guys, sila Moro and all of that. No, Moro, sorry, si Moro and all. It turned out that there were medyo may pagka-conservative sila, di ba? So they hated itong nirerectag nila itong mga sila Lula. So they were kind of mumbo-jumboing the due process. So eventually Lula was acquitted by the Supreme Court. So there was definitely bias there. So even their superstar prosecutors turned out later on to be inherently biased, ideologically biased. And then that, of course, created its own problem and Bolsonaro and all of that. In the case of the Philippines naman, bro, kamusta naman yung anti-corruption ni Pinoy? God bless his soul. I think he sent the right signal. But, ilan bang nakulong na super corrupt, right? And when the crisis was hitting closer to home, right? What was the response of the government, right? So, yun nga, so for me, that episode turned out as remember that Emerson quote na, if you strike a king, make sure you kill him, otherwise you're done, something like that. So corruption is like a horrible tyrant, right? If you strike it and you don't kill it, it's gonna come back for you.
Was that the Game of the Thrones?
No, it's Emerson. It's Emerson.
Equivalent sa Game of Thrones yung if you aim for the king, best not miss.
Yeah, something like that. So it's actually from Emerson that I think ginamit din sa Game of Thrones. So may pagka ganun ang tingin ko sa issue ng corruption. If you're gonna swing at it, you have to really do something substantial. If you miss, patay ka, it's gonna come back to auntie, which is exactly what you were arguing. So I think we're very much on the same page. At the same time, bro, meron tayong survey na luwas, for instance, in July 28, because I think Pulse Asia is a reference point, whereby it says 84% of those asked in a survey believe, quote, the power of national agencies, laws, and mechanisms to fight corruption must be strengthened. So it looks like, in principle, people in the Philippines are still against corruption. But yun nga, I don't think it's just as resonant as before, yeah.
That's an innocuous statement for me. Siyempre, di ba?
Yeah.
Kahit gano'ng kalinis yung bansa mo, you always believe that these agencies should be strengthened. Ano sasabihin mo? Hindi.
Right.
That these agencies should be weakened so that there's more corruption. I mean, that data point for me says that doesn't really say anything.
Mm-hmm.
Although mas interesting sa akin yung yung 84. So mas interesting sa akin yung labi, yung hindi nagsasabi na hindi dapat nilisin yung agency. Or gusto nila gawin mas matindi yung agency. So I don't really want to factor that in too much sa conversation natin. Ikaw, do you think it's important?
I'm actually conflicted on this. Yun nga, like, ito ba yung 16%? Parang ano to? No, I mean, yeah, you're right. Cynicism is a powerful force. Yun nga, kasi we took a swing at it and we missed it. We missed it big time. And I think there's a lot of skepticism among people. And I think you also, if you talk to a lot of people, ethnographic studies or just anecdotal evidence, many people have just like accepted na this is just part of the game, right? And diba,
pero alam mo bro, I actually also don't think na alam natin yung extent of corruption in the Philippines. Hindi natin pinaniniwalaan na hindi every time there's evidence to the contrary na maybe we're not as corrupt as we think, we kind of shun it. So for example, I remember there was this episode of one podcast. I think it was called, yung one podcast na pinapakinggan ko. And merong episode on yung reporting ng Economist wherein sinasabi nila na bumababa tayo sa crony capitalism index.
Right, right.
And they brought on an economist there and he said, of course not, impossible. We're so corrupt. And then wala siyang evidence.
Yeah.
And then the person who was interviewing him was like, oo nga, it's impossible. So like why do you think it's impossible na bumababa yung corruption natin? Or na less na bumababa tayo sa crony capitalism index? Is it just because you're so used to being told that the Philippines is corrupt that you cannot imagine a world when we're less crony capitalistic? Like, I don't know the methodology of economists anyway. So they said, the methodology of economists must be wrong. Maybe hindi sila nakikita. Hindi niya naman alam yung methodology eh. So at most, you shouldn't comment. Pero no, they were so convinced na mali. Di ba? Parang, so at the same time, like, there really are no indicators for corruption, di ba? The biggest indicator we have to compare Philippine corruption is perception, di ba? Perception. So Filipinos perceive that we're very corrupt. Okay, that's true. Is that an indicator of how corrupt we are really comparatively? No, I don't think so. And I think obviously mataas yung perception ng corruption natin sa Pilipinas because ever since the 1920s, we've been told by Americans that we are exceptionally corrupt. Remember, this is like historically, ito yung reason why the United States delayed our independence. So in 1920, the United States sent a Wood-Forbes commission to the Philippines. It was essentially a hatchet job by the Republican administration to delay independence. And they said one of the reasons why we should delay independence is because the Philippines is massively corrupt. And then what happened? That report got picked up by Peter Stanley. Then that Peter Stanley's book got picked up by Paul Hutchcroft and Alfred McCoy, and they repeated those observations over and over and over and over again. And we got told that we were exceptionally corrupt because of that discourse. But are we exceptionally corrupt? I mean, I'm sure we're corrupt, but I'm not entirely sure we are exceptionally corrupt the way this literature has portrayed it, right? There's no way to tell. It's all perception.
I mean, I remember in discussion natin on the Philippine National Bank and you very aggressively pushing back against, the demonization of the Filipino management of that, the whole Orientalist, right, trope. Nevertheless, I mean, for me, it's not just corruption, it's a type of corruption. So we have a lot of corruption in China, a lot of corruption in Malaysia, and yet it's more like what you call efficient corruption, right? It's a corruption that greases the wheels of industrialization, of state building, of urbanization. Di ba kitang-kita natin sa China, di ba? A lot of their growth is driven by local government units who do a lot of dodgy land, sales deals with companies and multinational. So a lot of corruption is going on, but a lot of growth is happening, a lot of poverty reduction is happening. So I think my concern with the Philippines is more like sub-Saharan African style in corruption sa atin. So in terms of volume, maybe it might not be as large as other countries as a share of GDP, right? But my sense is it's a very inefficient form of corruption, right? It's kind of corruption that goes into, I don't know, sustaining standing militias, into sustaining, I don't know, 5 Mercedes-Benz and BMWs, 20 mistresses, that kind of very inefficient, very self-indulgent Swiss bank, Caribbean, Panama Papers kind of corruption.
Ilalabas mo pa sa bansa.
Exactly. So that's my sense. My sense is I completely agree with you na wag na tayo mag-feeling na number one tayo sa lahat, including sa corruption. Because, if you've been to Russia, you've been to some Middle Eastern country or China, forget about it. Medyo mahirap yung competition na yan. Korea also, South Korea has a long history of corruption. Just look at with the Samsung family, the Samsung Air, just a few years ago, implicated in a kind of a corruption graft scandal. And yet, South Korea, look at how far they have come. So I think two levels yung problema ko, Lelo. One is, I think yung kung walang corrupt, walang mahirap, first of all, it's quite simplistic when you look at the actual evidence in a lot of semi-corrupt countries. But second is, it's correct insofar as the type of corruption that we have in the Philippines is concerned, which is the most inefficient form. But this brings us to the third issue, which you and I have been talking about, which is, meron na ba tayong cynical acceptance na talagang kasama ito sa ating political system itong corruption na yan. Parang hindi pa
So,
natin
sorry,
napag-usapan yung
Richard,
confidential fund.
let me
Yeah.
just push back a little bit. I think that we are probably not exceptionally corrupt for one parang very logical reason, which is that I think any electoral democracy combined with capitalism produces incentives for corruption and rent seeking. That is not exceptional to the Philippines, right? We just happen to be an electoral democracy with a lot of capitalism in Southeast Asia, and we just happen to be a country that's had that for a very long time. So I don't think it's anything like peculiar to the Philippines. I think it's just the incentives of electoral democracy and capitalism. If you want to solve that, I don't think if you want to solve that, I don't know kasi yung incentive structure ba, 'di ba? Yun talaga isa kapitalista ka, meron kang political system na pwede mong gain to make money. Your incentive is to make money. So obviously may corruption, and that's not an only in the Philippines thing. Although yeah, yung discussion about the quality, like I do need to think about that, but I just think it's extraordinary. We've been told we are the country that has been told by foreigners and ourselves that we're exceptionally corrupt for 100 years. Surely that has an impact on our mentality. Surely that has an impact, right? Singaporeans have a lot of crony capitalism, yet they're never told day in, day out, corrupt kayo, corrupt kayo, di ba? Parang, surely that does something. And I don't know how to quantify that, but definitely we have to account for that fact. I don't think there's any other Southeast Asian country that's been told day in, day out na exceptionally corrupt kayo. As compared with the Philippines. Like even comparatively, like sa Indonesia these days, like there's a lot of research on dynasties and rent seeking. Sasabihin ng mga Indonesian political scientists, we are seeing the Philippinization of Indonesian politics. I mean, Jesus Christ, di ba? So parang
I know.
talagang that type case for like exceptionally corrupt.
I know where
Like
you're coming from.
there's actually no quantitative metric to indicate that we are exceptionally corrupt. We're probably very corrupt. I'm not denying that, but
No,
just don't think
I see what you're doing, bro. I mean, you can completely see where you're. I see where you're coming from, which is hate na hate mo itong, especially you being based now in UC Berkeley and all, hate na hate mo itong orientalization of the Philippines as an exceptionally rotten case, right? I mean, even not only as a scholar, the level of human and Filipino, you kind of feel it's like, wait, parang Filipino bashing yan. Remember, this was always our issue with American writers. Every time
yeah.
they discuss Asia, yung Philippine chapter is always the worst one. Remember the Kaplan
Yeah.
book we discussed? I was disgusted by that book, right? So much that I said, like, I have to write in a couple of books to push back against it. Like, they look down at our food, our culture. They talk about Philippines as if it's a broken, corrupt country, like a hopeless case. I hate that. I hate that. So I see where you're coming from. Analytically, I see how we're trying to nuance each other. So none of us are saying hindi corrupt ang Pilipinas. Both of us are saying it's highly corrupt. But it's definitely not like the exceptionally corrupt case, etc. But yun nga rin bro, like wala kasing email-dific
Oo.
presidents yung mga ibang countries natin. Like, we just, yeah.
Si one MDB,
Yeah,
sa Malaysia.
the Najib's wife, no, I mean, siguro siya 2,000 Hermes bags, no, but it took some time,
Oo.
right? Like it took 30 years before Southeast Asia
Oo.
created the competition for Imelda.
Oo.
So that's also my concern with the discussions about Imelda, no, in the American Broadway show about Imelda, etc. It's that again it orientalizes the Philippines as this exceptionally hopeless, corrupt country, which is what we're not comfortable with because we feel corruption is a big problem in the Philippines, but it shouldn't be in a defeatist, right? And Orientalist way. Yun yung argument natin. But going back to, I mean, I also agree with you with Singapore, for instance. People don't talk about a lot of wealth in Singapore is because of the cronies from Indonesia and neighboring countries parking their money there. A lot of money laundering is happening there in Singapore. So, speaking of corruption and clean money, etc., mahabang usapan yan. But of course, in Singapore, good luck saying something against the government and getting away with it, speaking of Singaporean democracy. Now, going back to this, etong issue ng confidential fund. Alright, so I think the big picture pinag-usapan natin. My stance, bro, is the Philippines, I agree it's not exceptionally corrupt, but the type of corruption we have is a very kind of a sub-Saharan Africa. Am I orientalizing too? But it's a very inefficient form of corruption. So even if in terms of volume and share of GDP, it might not be as bad as, let's say, Russia, China, or even Malaysia, I think the corrosive impact is probably worse. But again, we can debate about that. But dito sa issue ng confidential fund, obviously, one camp is saying, kaya nga confidential right? And don't politicize this issue. There has to be certain degree of discretion. You're talking about the second most powerful person in the country. You're talking about the most popular person by number of votes, 32 million views. And on the other side, of course, you know the arguments like, alam natin nangyari dito, hindi naman ganyan yung time ni Lenny, blah, 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 blah. What's your stance on this issue? Now, let's talk about just the confidential
Okay,
fund issue.
okay. So medyo sensitive yung stance ko dito, and I'm sure I'm gonna get bashed again. Buti lang hindi siya written, kasi kung written to, I'm sure may excerpt na naman. So,
I'm
kung
shocked,
pakinggan
bro. I'm
Sara, ang
shocked.
sasabihin nila, the reason why kailangan mo ng confidential fund is because Secretary of Education siya at maraming recruitment ng komunista
Right.
sa universities. That's the big ostensible reason, di
Oops,
ba?
I see what's coming.
And I really think I think that's a stupid reason. That's a red. By the way, I want to stop using the word red tagging, because
Yeah.
red tagging is only in the Philippines phenomenon, and it's actually used for sometimes for me for used really imprecisely. The real word is red baiting. So I'm gonna push back. I've decided to push back and return the original word for it, which is red baiting. So I think that's a kind of red baiting issue. Well, actually, no, I changed my mind. Red tagging is also okay. That's Philippine English. So Philippine English is okay. I've always accepted Philippine English, but I prefer. But I've been using red baiting for a much longer time, and red tagging is like at most a 15-year-old Philippine English term. So I'll go to red baiting. So I think that's clearly red baiting. And red baiting of the worst variety, using the communist threat to legitimate kind of corruption, possible corruption or likely corruption in this particular
Alleged,
case.
alleged. Let's just be very
Alleged,
clear. Mahirap na. Alam mo na. Ganyan.
uh,
Alleged,
alleged
alleged,
or
like,
likely or something. Okay, let's say a policy that could easily lead to corruption, right? Um, Having said that, I do think there is a problem of communist recruitment in some universities, and I've been very public about this. And the reason why it's a problem is because I think yung mga estudyante natin na nare-recruit ay pwedeng mamatay, at maraming cases na nire-recruit sa university, dinadala sa red area, nababarel, namamatay. So I actually think it is a kind of threat to our youth. And I would be and okay naman kung may mga bata na who risk their lives for principle, and I mean I agree that a lot of these people are principled, but I don't think this is a cause that you should risk your life for. I mean, it is the cause ultimately for me of totalitarianism, because there is no communist party in the world that has voluntarily given up power, and that already tells you why this cause is bankrupt for me. So it's a problem. And I think the other problem with this confidential fund is yun nga, yung idea of confronting communism nababahiran ng corruption at ng kababuyan ng mga Duterte, which is for me as an anti-communist, which is really sad, right? Because I want to clean up the image. One of my goals is actually to clean up the image of anti-communism in the Philippines, to really connect it to its roots, which is pro-democracy, pro-free speech, anti-totalitarianism. And this is the exact opposite of that. Kaya medyo malungkot para sa akin, because one of the loneliest things to be in the Philippines is a democratic, non-fascist anti-communist. It's a very, very lonely space to be.
Well, I mean, we're still in a better place than a lot of our neighbors. Look at what happened in Indonesia, right? Essentially, genocide happened there in the mid 1960s, etc. But I
Yeah,
completely
yeah.
understand what you're saying. You know?
That's the worst kind of anti-communism, di ba? So my anti-communism is the anti-communism of Arthur Kessler. The
Yeah.
anti-communism George Orwell. I just feel like we don't have enough of that in the Philippines, and we won't have that because every time you voice something that's anti-communist, ang association sa'yo is Sara Duterte and Red Tagger, as opposed
Yeah.
to somebody who like loves 1984, who loves Hannah Arendt, for example, fell in love with the origins of totalitarianism. No, that's not the image
Right.
that's
So,
going
so
to
what you're saying
associate.
is that there's definitely a kind of instrumentalization and weaponization of the whole rhetoric on the need to fight against Stalinist, Leninist, Maoist kind of
Yeah,
Marxism, not necessarily by the best of people. And what
yeah.
makes it even worse is that you're not only giving a bad name, but that potentially this has also been instrumentalized for allegedly, not very good governance practices, right? To put it
Yeah.
very nicely. Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So ano pa ba ang reason bakit may confidential fund apart from that, Richard? Yun yung big one, di ba? Well, yung maganda yung rebuttal ni Ronald dun, sabi niya, hindi mo naman trabaho yan, assuming problema yan, trabaho yan ng military, di ba? Sila yung bigyan mo ng confidential fund, ay mas malaki pa yung confidential fund mo. Tama ba yung sabi ni Ronald? Mas malaki yung confidential fund kaysa sa confidential fund ng Nika?
Well, that's I think that's what Ronald said. My point is, Gibo Chodor, our defense secretary, came in. I mean, obviously, he wants to probably run for the Senate in a few years. Well, I mean, he's a very smart guy. I think he's doing a fantastic job as a defense minister, etc. But he said something along the lines of, well, this insurgency manipulation of the kids is a legitimate security issue. So yeah, DepEd maybe should have some sort of fund to deal with. Of course, what I think he didn't properly answer is why this large, no? Of course, the Sara argument will be because we're dealing with millions of pupils here, and
What?
therefore
Yeah,
the scale of
and why does it have to be confidential? Pwede namang ano yan, pwede naman lantaran yan, pwede naman magkaroon ng discussions on campus about what communism is, Pwede naman yun,
well, I mean, probably they're saying some aspect of the anti-communism is really sensitive operations, real-time intelligence, kind of charva charva. So we cannot have open itemization of all of that. I mean, for me, the problem also there was yung ginawa nilang splitting. So like there's already an item given. I mean, like there's a budget item given to you, and then split yan into many mini stuff, right? And that's raising questions like what's going on here. Ako naman, let's be honest. Probably again, probably this is a kind of consuelo. The Department of National Defense was promised to who again during election period? Well, that person didn't get the Department of National Defense. So maybe this is the consuelo. Like, okay, you don't get the DND, but you get 433, I don't know, guards and
Yes.
like.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, for me, that's the easiest explanation. Tapos na usapan. Ganun kasimple lang yan. Yeah?
Alam mo, kung ikaw si Bongbong, matatakot ka rin kay Sara kahit paano eh. You probably want to delay. There's a split already, di ba? And, Ronald is convinced nga based on your podcast that mag-opposition na yan during the election, but you want to delay it as much as possible so that you don't take hits early, so that when you go into the midterm, parang medyo recently ka palang binabanatan. I mean, yung mahirap yung ano dito is yung best example dito is si Binay, 'di ba? Si Binay kaya siya humina as a presidential candidate is because he took sustained hits for almost a year.
Yeah.
And if Marcos wants to be strong, I'm sure he's going to be strong, but he wants to be as strong as possible during the midterm. You want to delay yung attacks for as long as possible, and this is I think one way of doing that. I think it's on the one hand there's a kind of political canniness to it, but on the other hand, it's delaying and inevitable. Don't you think? You think it's in? Because I'm only saying it's inevitable based on your conversations with Ronald.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for me, there are multiple time horizons, no, and there are multiple routes that. I mean, there's nothing set in stone. There a lot of contingency still involved. You know how I approach things. That's why I can predict a lot of things because I'm open to contingency, right? And I look at a lot of factors. Then, I mean, if you've read Super Forecasters, it's a fantastic book that talks about how you don't have to be a specialist in order to properly predict future trends, and that sometimes specialists actually tend to be worst in prediction because they're too obsessed with few variables. They miss the big picture. Exactly. So going back to this, Ken, I always try to keep a healthy distance from political actors, because if you're too much talking to one actor over the other, distorted yung view mo, diba? So I just try to, a little bit here, a little bit there, etc. So again, we're saying allegedly there's lack of transparency and etc. there, but for me, my understanding is that there's also a political coalition building aspect to this confidential fund, considering na hindi napunta yung DND dun sa tao na pinangakuan at, I'm not justifying, I'm just explaining what's happening here. Now, on your question, Leloy, on the coalition and all of that, I mean, the reality is there is a mutually assured destruction situation between the two of them, right? I think Marcos and Sara, both of them have an incentive to keep things on an even keel until 2028, right? So that in the meantime, hindi threaten masyado si Marcos, but at the same time, Sara has it smoothly going in that direction. Now, that could be like the ideal situation perhaps for both of them under the so-called unity, but we know that reality is 50 shades, right? And in the meantime, a lot of other things are happening. I think the aspect of the father trying to flex muscles and sometimes even embarrass BBM with what he did with the special envoy, this very rabbit attacks. I mean,
Like,
on his foreign policy.
as a special envoy,
Yeah, yeah,
Richard,
yeah.
as special envoy of
Stuff.
China.
We can talk about the prepositions too.
Uh,
And then, again, I think the jury's still out on this. I'm not yet convinced that we have a full understanding of how Machiavellian or good Machiavellian the president can get, right? There are moments that you say, okay, this guy knows what he's doing. And then there are moments that he's very conflict avoidant, right?
mm,
So as I said, maybe in the first year it makes sense. But this second year, we have to really understand what is the method of his leadership. Because for Marcos Jr., if ever there's going to be really a split, as Ronald and all are talking about, he has to have more risk appetite. And I think if you're Marcos Jr., given his temperament, he'd rather have things on, I mean, essentially minimum friction. He wants to get to the target with the minimum kind of
yeah.
resistance and all, right? But there will come a time, whether he wants it or not, that things could get out of control, including yung nakita
Yeah.
natin with Arroyo, Martin Romualdez situation, all of these realignments that are
Yung
happening.
coup attempt.
Yeah, exactly. So if you're Marcos Jr., you'll constantly try to keep things below a certain threshold so you can properly manage them and keep above the fray. But at some point,
Ganda.
that threshold could be passed because there are
Ganda.
many hungry vultures out there in our
Yeah,
Philippine
yeah,
politics.
yeah.
So that's what I'm watching
tanong
here.
ko dito, ang tanong ko dito, Richard, how do you manage the fact na, okay, nag-away kayo sa loob, pero political insiders lang naman or yung may nakikinig sa inyo ni Ronald, yung may alam na meron talagang split.
Yeah.
For the average Filipino, unit team pa rin yan. And as a result, pareho yung base nila. So if you're Bongbong, and you know this, na pareho yung base mo, how are you negotiating that tension?
Ako, bro, I mean, for me, probably it's the opposite, right? I think people who actually have more information on the inside, a lot of them don't buy the split issue. They think that still the Sara Marcos thing is holding together. They're finding a kind of an equilibrium that is actually on the outside. That is away ng mga bloggers that perhaps people are overthinking that there's a fight between the Duterte and Marcos camp. So actually, the funny thing is you hear more nuance from people who are informed with insight Malacanang politics and saying no, it's exaggerated. We're trying to steal paper over it. Because remember, conservatives and right-wing people, what brings them together is shared interest, right? And shared interest is a very powerful force. Unlike progressives,
Yeah.
they're gonna keep on
Also,
fighting because of
So
ideology.
yun nga, back to my question, pareho yung base. So kung ikaw si Bongbong, how are you nga negotiating the fact na pareho pa rin yung, kahit magbanatan kayo ni Sara, pareho kayo ng base?
Yeah, so for me,
Era,
the issue of the base, I think, again, we can have more ethnographic study, etc. about that, and midterm elections will expose a lot. But for me, Leloy, tignan mo yung mga surveys, di ba? Yung presidential for 2028, down to 25 to 30% ulit si Sara. So that means yung 60% na yan, medyo nawala na, right? Up for grabs na naman.
Ano si Sara?
Remember yung surveys about 2028 who are the presidential ball? Tingnan mo yung numbers ni Sara. 25%, 27%, 30%, right? It's not 60%. So actually, it's not a solid 60% uni team to begin with. I think this was really a tactical alliance and a kind of a multiplier effect kind of thing. Tulfo is eating to that remaining 20-30%. So do you get what I'm saying? So
Kasi yung
base
idea
argument,
of
yeah.
strongman voters actually inaccurate because a lot of it is still regional voting patterns.
Yeah. Vismin pa. Yeah, I get what you're saying. It's solid south, solid north, etc. But which brings me to the second point, bro.
Variables
Yeah,
dun sa idea ng base.
exactly. There's a lot of elasticity there that I think is not appreciated. There's elasticity there. Now, and I think this is where I want to end this episode because it became longer than I thought because of our back and forth on the issue of corruption. So, may mga kasi nagko-comment, Leloy, dyan na, what do you mean by we're not exceptionally corrupt but we're highly corrupt? Ano yun, parang half buntis ka or something like that. May mga comments saying, no. What we're saying is that it's not like the Philippines is not top 5 in the world forever. Maybe we're top 30 most corrupt. I don't know, 40 corrupt. But don't think that the Philippines is automatically more corrupt than practically 99% of the countries there, right?
Ito lang talaga yung sasabihin ko sa'yo. Ulit, sa viewers natin, if for more than 100 years, sinasabihan ka ng sinasabihan ng lahat ng tao na ikaw ay sobrang corrupt, don't you think that's going to distort don't you think may epekto yun? May konting distortionary effect yun? Ano yung extent ng distortion? We can debate that. Pero siguro naman meron, di ba? Meron namang distortion na nangyari. Yun lang.
Yeah, I mean, we are probably 7, 8 out of 10, but we think we're 20 out of 10. Something like that. I think that's what we're saying to quantify it. No, but the last thing I want to say, Lalo, here is, remember we were discussing about Risa and all of that, and so over the weekend in Taiwan, we were guests of the Democratic Progressive Party. So Risa was also one of the guests in the event. Christian Esguerra asking a very interesting question, the very questions that we have been exploring 6 months, 1 year earlier, right off the bat, which is saan nakakulang ang opposition, saan nakakulang ang progressive. And as you heard in my discussion with Ronald, it looks like some in the opposition don't want to run as a slate anymore. They want to do, multi-front, a little bit with Pacquiao, I don't know, a little bit with Tulfo, I don't know, maybe a little bit behind the scenes with Martin Romualdez or Marcos. That is also an important dynamic, diba? Because for me, the fact that opposition has been weak is one reason why Marcos Jr. can be more moderate. I mean, it's very paradoxical, only in the Philippines probably.
Yes.
Because he's not threatened by the opposition, he can take a healthy distance from the Dutertes. Because if he's threatened by the
Yes.
opposition, he has to lean on the Dutertes. It's a weird situation. I don't like saying it, but that's exactly how it's turning out. So if some people in the opposition perhaps have
Okay.
also sensed that, and they're saying maybe if you want Marcos to move in the right direction, you have to further, quote unquote, engage with him, and that you have to accelerate this process of realignment. Obviously, that has a lot of risks and moral questions and moral dilemmas that is raising for a whole host of people. So I ask also Riza, what do you feel about this situation kung saan when it comes to foreign policy, BBM, is closer to an Aquino, right, than Duterte by far. And on issues like drug war, etc., he's definitely not progressive. There's still problems with human rights and democracy issues. May lawyer lang na namatay sa Abra, so we clearly have some EJK issues, problems in the country, to put it mildly, if you can ever. I mean, but still, BBM has turned out not as a dictator that everyone expected. If anything, the criticism I hear, including from Nancy Binay types, is that masyado siyang mabait. Which is like, what's going on here? So ano ba talaga gusto niyo? Ayaw ba dictator? Gusto niyo mabait? Now, of course, I know what they mean. That's mean, be more decisive in dealing with corruption and all. I get it. But still, di ba? Meron tayong itong rhetoric na we need a matapang leader. And then, ay, baka maging diktador. Like, make up your minds, folks. Like, what are we, you get what I'm saying, right?
So tama talaga si Tiglao, Benigno Aquino the Third 2.0.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yung bang lumalabas.
in that sense. But you're absolutely right. You're spot on Riza also. No, I mean Riza was already had so much to offer 10, 15 years ago when I had more chance to interact with them back in the day. But I think she has really leveled up. I mean, what's your assessment of? I mean, Congressman Castro is amazing, and I hope I can get to interview her soon. And I think she deserves way more media coverage. But Riza Ontiveros is, I think, finally assuming the mantle of leadership of opposition in ways that we were hoping she will do six. Like parang hindi na pinagsaban masyado si Lenin na eh. Ito na, talagang
Itong
Riza na eh.
itong confrontation niya with Sara and yung kanyang back and forth, including yung kanyang mga witty retorts sa social media, it's a bit of a coming out party for her, no?
Yeah.
As the leader of opposition, and I'm so glad she leapt at this opportunity because unconscionable naman talaga tong fund na to. There's no, I can't see how this can be justified. I just can't see how this can be justified. Like, yun nga, on so many grounds, like, you're the vice president, you're the secretary of education. These are not really positions that require huge confidential funds. Kahit may budget allocation for that, hindi ka pwede basta-basta maglalagay. Kahit may line item for that, hindi ka pwede maglagay ng ganyang pagkalaki-laking pera kung yung line item allocation is actually zero. Hindi ka pwede mag-move around ng funds.
Which is where the whole DAP came from, right? The DAP ruling.
Dahil nga si Bersamin ay nag-group, meron ng jurisprudence around that. So this is a really strong case for Risa.
Yeah.
Yung tanong lang, so in a sense, because the opposition really dislikes the Dutertes, talagang pwede mag-unite yung opposition around Risa. And yung maganda dito, I think, ako lang pero ang lumalabas sa sentiment ngayon is probably the opposition hates the Dutertes more than the Marcoses. So it's very good to go after Sara, who's really acting like a brat, right? And may common discourse before, di ba, na itong dalawa, yung the younger Duterte and the younger Marcos are both spoiled children of caudillos, right? It seems like the Duterte child is acting more like the spoiled kid of a caudillo than the Marcos child.
Lele, there's a big difference between new rich and old new rich. let me just put it that way. I think that explains. The old new rich versus new rich. All right. Yeah, I think we agree. And on that note, I think we can wrap up the episode. Yeah, I think this. If one thing great came out of this whole confidential fund discussion, if I can even put it that way, is I think now my clarity na tayo, who is the really leader of opposition, and honestly, I can more confident talk about 2028. I mean, I can already envision. I'm not saying it's gonna happen, but a Riza Sara showdown, maybe with Tulfo as the third party. Hindi yung third party ni Robinhood Padilla. Third party. I don't know. Now it looks more, legitimate possibility to me. I'm not saying it's gonna happen, but it's easier for me to envision it as a possibility in 2028.
I like it.
I know.
I like it.
That's it. Thank you very much, bro. Talk to you soon.
Salamat.
So, okay, let's just do a shorter second episode. I know napatagal ito. Let's just talk about, the usual stuff. Okay. All right, Leloy, napahaba yung sa episode natin about confidential fund and corruption because, again, I know where you're coming from. I think you being based in the US, in UC Berkeley, it has made you probably more conscious about pushing back against Orientalist tropes,
Ano yung
Yeah.
reputation ng university namin? Okay.
No. I mean, okay, I'll just say generally Filipino scholars in the US tend to be like that. And
Ah,
I'm sure you have dealt with a lot of nonsense, right? Ako kasi I'm more in the policy world so I don't deal with as much as that. But I know, unfortunately, in the academic world, there's a lot of Orientalist tropes vis-a-vis the Philippines. And I'm very glad with what you're doing here. But yun nga, I just had to do a little bit nuancing kasi alam ko gagamitin ng mga haters natin. Oh, sabi ni Lele, wala palang
oh,
problema sa corruption. Okay pala tayo. Like,
kahit anong pasakali mo.
yeah, exactly. Now, woof. But you also being there in San Francisco in California, let's talk about this, bro. Because over the past few weeks or so, I've been, constantly on the road, and one of the things that I listen to, one of the podcast things I've been listening to is this guy Mustafa Suleyman, right? This fantastic guy, very much at the forefront of the artificial intelligence debate. Ako, I've been writing on artificial intelligence even pre-pandemic times, etc. So I was always a bit skeptical about technological disruption. I never bought the hype. Even on the chat GPT, all of that, I was always a little bit skeptical about whether this is going to really help, about the net benefits of that. But after listening to Mustafa Suleyman, especially someone who's actually not a programmer himself, but someone who's as a semi-outsider is now insider, and the way he explains it in a kind of a very plain policy, progressive language even, medyo mas natakot ako Kasi yung time frame also is very much shorter. He's looking at 3 to 5 years before this hits us. And the number that I heard from him is actually scarier than I thought. So what he's saying is that you have a 10x factor of improvement in terms of parameters and things that an AI can do every year. So every year it's 10 times better than the year before. So it's like iPhone 2 mo is 10 times better than iPhone 1. Not 2 times better, not 3, but 10 times better. So can you imagine what's gonna be AI in 3 to 5 years? Now, of course, natakot tayo because first of all, AI is threatening already journalism, who knows academic work, copywriting, even lawyers, accountants. But as a Filipino, I'm also worried about the impact it has on growth engines in the Philippines, including the BPO industry. Because already in
Yeah.
India and Brazil, which are huge BPO powers also, there are
Yeah.
also a lot of worries about how AI could replace a lot of, let's say, medium range skills that
Yeah.
human beings are doing. Let's talk about that, bro, because you're closer to Silicon Valley than me. I mean, literally, geographically. How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I'm close, but there is still some distance. So just some geography about the Bay Area. The Bay Area consists of San Francisco, which some Filipinos mistakenly call SFO. That's the airport. So it's not SFO, it's San Francisco.
Yeah.
SFO is the airport. There's the East Bay, which is Berkeley, Oakland, and then deeper into the East Bay. And then there's the South Bay, and the South Bay is where Silicon Valley is. So may konting
Right.
distansya. So South Bay, nandun yung Stanford, nandun yung Silicon Valley, nandun yung Facebook, and nandun din si Mustafa Suleiman. The driverless cars are actually in San Francisco in SF.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of world. It's actually a big place. So dito sa Berkeley, we don't interact with as many tech people as you would if you were, say, in the South Bay, which
Yeah.
is where all that stuff is. But obviously top of mind ng lahat ng conversations, because one of the reasons why malakas ang tech dito sa area na to is because you have these two powerhouse universities that have terrific computer science programs and engineering programs at malaking startup culture. Of course, you
Yeah.
have the main one when it comes to this, yung rival namin, yung Stanford, and then kami SAUC Berkeley, which also has a huge computer science program. Kaya even nga now sa San Francisco, there's a lot of urban blight there. There's a lot of homelessness.
Yeah.
Maraming offices na closed. Ang dami pa rin dumarating na AI companies, and then there's a huge AI startup industry there right now because nandito pa rin yung engineers, and they know, they're betting on it, that in the future ito yung talaga magiging malaking business. And when we think
Yeah.
of AI, a lot of people say chat GPT, OpenAI, for example. Pero hindi lang sila eh. So I was listening to Mustafa Suleyman nga, and
Fifteen thousand,
he's
I
not
heard. 15,000
huh?
startups. I heard 15,000 startups. So OpenAI is just one of 15,000 out there. It's
Yeah,
insane, man.
yeah. And yung
Wow.
kay Mustafa Suleyman, his is pangalan niya yung
Uh,
ang ano niya is
inflection?
inflection
Yung inflection.
AI,
Yeah, yeah,
inflection
yeah,
AI,
yeah.
and yung chat program nila is actually PI, which is not very nice sounding for
Personal
Filipino.
intelligence. It's not.
Si PI.
It's not Tatay
So,
Digong. Yeah.
hindi ito yung kaibigan ni Duterte na PI ito yung AI na
Yeah,
PI.
yeah.
So, kausapin niyo yung AI na PI, and actually interesting because ibang-iba yung personality ni PI kaysa kay ChatGPT. Si PI malambing, madaldal, nagjo-joke, at pwede mong kausapin about your problems.
Yeah.
So, nagulat ako because parang actually the first thing I realized is that there's a kind of personality already to AI. Si PI is actually funny, and PI is actually supposed to be empathetic. Si ChatGPT is not empathetic, very formal, di ba?
Yeah,
Ito
yeah.
ito parang katropa mo pag kinausap niyo. Tayo libre pa rin si PI ngayon eh. And then the other thing I did was nag-subscribe ako to GPT-4 and compared it
Yeah.
to GPT 3.5. So I was asking GPT 3.5, the free version, to write me certain essays about Taylor Swift songs, about my favorite Taylor Swift song, Last Great American Dynasty, which
Yeah.
is just a brilliant song. And I was prompting it to write me like really deep essays about the image of the parvenu in Taylor Swift. And it was decent at 3.5. I would say that would have been a B paper.
Yeah.
Pagdating mo sa 4, I would have given that a B plus. So, it's really, you feel the improvements.
Yeah. Scary. No, I mean,
Yung 10x ngayon is
10x
believable.
is scary,
Play
right?
around.
Yeah.
Just play around with this AI, and you'll feel it. You'll feel the real improvement. So ikaw, I have a question for you, Richard. Pagdating sa AI, and I know this is overly reductive, are you more optimistic or are you more afraid?
The paradox with me is I'm a technophobe, and yet I constantly try to use the latest technology to make the most out of things. I mean, you can see what I'm doing, right? We're doing vlogging,
Mm.
zooming. I'm both fascinated by new technology, and at the same time, I tend to be more skeptical about our ability to regulate things in the effective way in the right time, precisely because of tingnan mo naman yung politika natin ngayon, 'di ba? It's so hard to even agree on basic facts. So I understand you can make an argument that back in the day, I don't know, in 1950s, Oppenheimer, all of that, everyone thought we'll have nuclear Armageddon. Well, it didn't happen. There was good diplomacy, Soviet Union, US. But I don't see that anymore. Ang gulo na ngayon eh. Yeah, so I think one big influence on me is this great book by Moises Naim, the former publisher and founder of the Foreign Policy magazine. He was the finance minister of Venezuela. Brilliant guy, very, very smart guy. The title of his book was The End of Power. So he wrote this around 20 years ago. And he looks at how, over the past half a century or so, it's increasingly hard to concentrate power and to build consensus because there's just more people, there's more mobility, there's more disagreement, there's more power for spoilers, right? So mas magulo yung physics of power, right? And if you look at it, people who have read and recommended the book are people from, I don't know, Bill Clinton to, I don't know, future AI tech company guys. So I've been hugely influenced by the End of Power book by Moises Naim, which I think is very, very helpful. And the more it makes sense, and also the AI superpowers, no? Another fantastic book that I suggest guys to read. This is by Kai Fu Lee, who is one of the founders, the guys behind Siri, no? So I've been into this for quite some time. Ang akin lang, the speed is a little bit too fast, faster than I thought, and I listen to a
Yung
lot of people.
regulation mo
Yan
be
nga
able to
eh.
keep up.
I didn't know it's 10x eh. I thought it's probably 5x, 3x, 2x, but and then I did an experiment the other month dun sa
Di ba
ChatGPT.
nakausap si PI? Hindi ka pa nag-PI?
Hindi ko pa ako nag-PI.
Mag-PI
Yeah, I
ka
know.
soon.
I kept on listening kasi the idea of PI is he's like your beshi. It's like both pet and best friend and all of that. It's fascinating.
Ah,
I love the idea. I mean, diba, essentially they said we can have four types of relationship with AI, right? They're your pet, they are your
ah,
best friend and personal assistance for free probably. And third, they are your slaves. So that's where abusive
mm,
relationship, like kids, toddlers hitting their
ah,
dolls and Barbie because it's not. And the fourth, we treat them as demigods, right? So there are
ah.
four types of relationship.
Kinausap ko si PI about away ni Sara Duterte tsaka ni
Yeah,
Martin
exactly.
Romualdez.
But bro, I definitely have to do that. Pero dun sa chat GPT, something, I found this kind of, kasi bro, I don't know if you